This is episode number 1 on a series highlighting some of the greatest conquerors in all of Earth's history. This episode is centered on the Middle Age Mongolian conqueror Genghis Khan. A lot is said about him, but many important details that really defined his legacy are often omitted from discussions regarding his life. We will be covering his beginnings and origin, his accomplishments, military conquests, and also the Mongol Empire they thrust into a world power. Now let's begin. It is the year 1219. The great Genghis Khan, already well known and wielding a fearsome epithet, had surprisingly sent the Shah of Khwarezmia 2 missions, hoping to establish good trade relations between the two empires. One of the governors rashly imprisoned the first caravan sent by the Khan, as he underestimated the power of the Mongols. Genghis, wanting to resolve this conflict peacefully, sent another delegation of 3 ambassadors of Mongol and Muslim descent, since Khwarezm was an Islamic empire. In response to this, the Shah doubled down and boldly murdered the ambassadors. To the Mongols, killing ambassadors and messengers is one of the most offensive acts one can commit. Genghis Khan was furious, and in response to this, he and the Mongols acted decisively. What came next shook the entire world and the course of history. Genghis Khan was a Mongol conqueror during the 12th and 13th centuries, creating the largest land empire in history. Khan was born with the name Temujin around 1162, near the border between Mongolia and Siberia. According to the secret history of the Mongols, a primary source from the 13th century whose author is unknown, Temujin legendarily was born holding a blood clot the size of a knucklebone. They arranged to have the young Temujin marry Taborte, the daughter of Dei Sesen. Interestingly, the reason for this was that they both had a fire in their eyes and light on their face. However, his childhood was incredibly troubled due to the chaos during the time he was living in. Soon after arranging the marriage, his father, Yasuge, was poisoned by a rival. His entire clan deserted him, and Temujin was alone with his mother and siblings to survive. He had no one to protect himself and his family, and this led to an incredibly difficult childhood. But in the end, this childhood instilled the ability for him to fend for himself and a cunningness which shaped the young Temujin into what he became in the future. By several accounts, the young Genghis Khan had been described as a very charismatic individual, leading many to support him. From this point in his life, he had gathered a small but very loyal band of followers. During this time, Temujin attempted to return and reclaim the previously mentioned Borte, as he was now a little bit more stable than previously. He accomplished this with the help of 2 others, Togrul Khan and Jemuka. Togrul, also known as Ong Khan, was originally the young Genghis Khan's patron and mentor. Together, they both gained power for fighting against the Tatars. However, Genghis got a much lesser title than Togrul, and out of jealousy, they both openly engaged each other in battle. From this conflict against Togrul, Genghis Khan came out on top, gaining much more power among his people. After this campaign, Genghis Khan targeted the other previously mentioned figure that helped him recover Borte, Jamaka. Ironically, it was Borte who advised Genghis Khan to disalign from Jamaka and separate. Early in their childhood, Temujin and Jamaka were extremely close friends, to the point where they may have even had a blood brother ritual. In fact, Jamaka helped Temujin recover his wife Borte when she was kidnapped, like previously stated. The secret history of the Mongols also describes Temujin and Jamaka with words like sworn friends and brothers. As they grew up, both wanted power and to control the Mongol tribes. As is expected, this created a lot of tension between the two. However, the tension grew to the point where they were each other's obstacles to controlling the Mongol tribes. Genghis Khan needed to eliminate Jamaka, and he did. According to legend, he broke the back of Jamaka, an honorable death with no blood spilled, and he gave his old friend a decent funeral. Unopposed, this led him claiming several tribes and eventually reuniting all the Mongol tribes. Next to the river Onan, he was crowned with the new name Genghis Khan, the supreme leader of the Mongols. He took control of the empire around the year 1206. After consolidating his power, the upstart Genghis Khan needed to prove himself and secure the borders of his empire. This was the first time the Mongol Empire looked to expand, as before Genghis Khan, the nomadic people were separated with no central ruler. Before we discuss some of his campaigns, it is important to conceptualize the basic structure of the Mongol army, but we will go over this with more depth later. It contained many skilled horsemen, and the army itself was not very large. Most of the Mongol population were either soldiers or somehow helped soldiers. They commonly used tactics such as ambushes, siege tactics, and many spies to win battles. Now to start off, he married his daughter off to Uyghur Khan, the ruler of the Uyghurs in China. After accomplishing this alliance, he attacked the Xia dynasty. This kingdom contained the Tanguts, a group of Tibetan-speaking tribes in China. Although outnumbered 2-1, he came out victorious. After this success, the Mongol Empire looked towards a much larger and powerful enemy, the Jin dynasty. After the Jin dynasty practically forced the Mongols into war, as they controlled a vital Silk Road trade route, Khan had no choice but to accept. The campaign lasted for 23 long years and ended after the final siege of Kaizhou. Notable engagements included the ambush of the Jin forces at Badger Pass, the first battle of the war, the capture of Zhongdu, the Jin capital, forcing their king to flee, and the fall of Kaifeng, orchestrated by Genghis' son, Ogadai Khan. And now, on our timeline, we get to the Mongol attack on the Khwarezmian Empire. There are many estimates about how large the Mongol army was, but nevertheless, it was much smaller than the Shah's army, and they relied on their superior tactics and foreign engineers/experts to win. Although tired from the journey, as Khwarezmi is quite far from Mongolia, the Mongol army, under the Khan's generals, won their first few battles, such as the siege of Otrar. Next came the sieges of Bukhara, Samarkand, and Urgench. Particularly bloody was the siege of Samarkand, where prisoners were used as shields and pyramids of skulls were created from the inhabitants of the city. The siege of Urgench was also quite difficult, as the location was marshy. During this time, while General Subutai, the Khan's greatest general, and Jochi were chasing the Shah, he died from unknown causes. Next was the Khorasan campaign, which was headed by Tolui to capture the western part of Khwarezmia. Last was the final campaign of capturing the Shah's son. This was easily accomplished due to the empire falling apart and this war in which the Mongols absolutely dominated their opponents. Throughout the campaign, the Mongols not only just captured the land and ruler, they also tried to commit other atrocities to avenge the ambassadors. These actions include burning farmland, irrigation destruction, and massacring civilians. The fall of Khwarezmia would be a sign to the rest of the world to never disrespect him again. Next, to consolidate even more power, Genghis Khan quickly ravaged the nearby areas of Azerbaijan and Armenia. Next came the first Mongol invasion of Russia. This time, Genghis Khan did not take part in the campaign, instead electing to send his generals Jebe and Subutai to lead the attack. The results were at this point expected, and the prowess of the Mongol cavalry was revealed. The campaign culminated at the Battle of Kalka River, where an army led by Mstislav III of Kiev was destroyed by the Mongol forces. Most of the army was decimated, while Mongol casualties were few. And now comes the final campaign of the great Genghis Khan. Ironically, he was off fighting the aforementioned Tangids in the Xia kingdom. It was a brutal victory for the Mongols, even though both sides had fought each other many times and were familiar with each other's strategies. The defeated troops then hid in a castle at Ningxia, but regardless, the Mongols chased them out and won. The western Xia surrendered. It is said that during the campaign, Genghis Khan accidentally fell off his horse and simply died. He was succeeded as Khan by his son Ogedai, who continued the conquest of lands and also gained a foothold in Eastern Europe. His tomb has still not been found today, even though archaeologists have been continuously looking for it. Legendarily, he lies in an unmarked grave, and everyone who witnessed his death was killed to not reveal the secret of his burial place. There may have even been a river that was moved to flow over it. Regardless, he suffered quite a simple death for arguably the greatest conqueror of all time. Besides expansion, Genghis Khan brought several changes to the Mongol Empire. For one, he encouraged lots of trade through the Silk Road. Furthermore, he instituted complete religious freedom in his empire. Even though Genghis Khan was a Tengrist, which is an ancient religion prevalent in the Asian steppe region, he allowed his subjects to choose whatever religion they believed in. This rule also applied to capture people from his campaigns, and Genghis Khan told administrators to rule over them lightly. Additionally, the Mongol Empire created a postal and mail system called the Yam. This postal system operated through horseback riding messengers that traveled from Yam to Yam until the message reached its intended point. This system, useful for the empire, also provided an important dimension to Mongol battle tactics, and often proved to be an advantage to the Mongols. Genghis Khan also instituted the Yasa, a secret law code for his empire, created after the siege of Bokhara. The Yasa was implemented by his successor after his death and was influential for centuries. The code was based on Genghis Khan's life and experience in the military and sought to punish crimes severely and keep the Mongol Empire united. This last goal is particularly important because up until the rise of Genghis Khan, the nomadic Mongols had been loyal to regional chiefs, not a Khan which ruled over all the Mongols. After he died, Ogadai Khan took power, and after Ogadai died, several power disputes between potential successors slowly caused the empire to split up and crumble. Genghis Khan laid the foundations for the most efficient fighting force of his time, his empire's very own army. The army was divided into Minghan, which each consisted of 1,000 soldiers. The soldiers were trained very well, and every fighter had to be professional, but more importantly, loyal. In return for their service, a governing body called the Charku provided soldiers with equal amounts of loot. Ordinarily, soldiers were not allowed to actually do looting without permission, so this was the only way to ensure they got paid and were happy. Armies were composed of many different ethnicities, such as Turks, Persians, and Georgians, in addition to the Mongols. This was because the Mongols often allowed conquered people to join their army, so long they could prove their loyalty and were qualified. As mentioned previously as well, the army used the YAM system to communicate efficiently between armies and commanders. Weapons used by the Mongol army include axes, but by far the most important one used was the bow and arrow. Different types of bows were used throughout the Mongol Empire's history, but during Genghis Khan's time, smaller bows were primarily used. To travel on the battlefield, soldiers in their army rode horses, and they wore soft, light leather armor. One of the things that often separated the Mongols from their enemies was their battle tactics. And these tactics were masterminded by not only Genghis Khan, but also his generals. Subutai was one of his greatest generals and rose from humble origins to power only because of his merit. Jebe was also another prominent figure, and his story is a very interesting one. He was originally captured at the Battle of 13 Sides and actually shot Genghis Khan. In exchange for sparing him, Jebe served him loyally and became his second greatest general after the previously mentioned Subutai. Words cannot truly describe the magnitude of Genghis Khan's impact. Having the greatest land empire of all time, he caused multiple empires to fall, death of millions of people, and spread of deadly diseases. These are absolutely horrendous crimes that definitely should not be ignored when evaluating Genghis Khan's legacy. However, on the flip side, a merit-based system was created, trade prospered, and religious freedom was created. It is even said from the various children and relatives that he had, 16 million people right now are his direct descendants. Ultimately, Whether the legacy of Genghis Khan is positive or negative is up for debate. It is undeniable that he truly shaped what the planet is today. Finally, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode of the Great Conquerors podcast, make sure to stay tuned for future installments in the series. Both a document with all the sources and the script for this episode will be linked in the description below. The next episode will be about Zenobia, a queen of the ancient empire of Palmyra. Once again, thank you for listening, and hopefully you enjoyed this episode of the podcast.